Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, a Pittsburgh Steelers podcast made by fans like you, for fans like you. Now, here's your host, Joe Kuzma.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. My name is Joe Kuzma, and I am in draft mode, as you may be as well. The NFL draft is just around the corner, and many of us may have overlooked a bit of news that happened in the National Football League over the past week that may affect how the Pittsburgh Steelers, how they draft in the first round, the position they're going to take and who's available. And what might this news be? Well, as you may be familiar with a certain now former Cincinnati Bengals safety, Reggie Nelson, he just signed a $4 million guaranteed deal with the Oakland Raiders just this past week. It was toward the latter part of the week, and I'm just catching up to it now, but I had some time to let this kind of settle in. And what I'm always trying to do here with Steel City Underground is get people thinking. We have our fandom, we have our passion, and I've been talking about this a lot lately, how sometimes our emotions let us get the better part of our thoughts, okay? I'm going to tell you a little bit about something like last year, okay? We were constantly looking for a cornerback, okay? Everyone thought the Steelers were going to go corner again, and I was harping on it, and I was saying, no. Now, this year, that could be a little bit different of a reality, but Reggie Nelson getting a deal from the Oakland Raiders now puts an obstacle in front of the Pittsburgh Steelers that they might have to hurdle over. And let me explain. Last year when we wanted a corner, a lot of people had Marcus Peters, who ended up going to the Kansas City Chiefs about, Marcus Peters was pick number 18 by the Kansas City Chiefs in the 2015 draft. The Steelers had the pick 22. So if I'm doing my math correctly, that's about 5 picks, I guess, in between where Marcus Peters went and where the Steelers ended up taking Bud Dupree. Okay. So Marcus Peters was something of an enigma. He had some off-the-field issues, and people were wondering if the Rooneys and the Pittsburgh Steelers were willing to deal with Marcus Peters. Now, as you may or may not be aware, Marcus Peters had one heck of a rookie season as a corner for the Chiefs. Part of that excellent defense that Kansas City put on the field last season. So, Peters was off the board before the Steelers even had a chance at 22 to get him. He was gone at 18. Why is that important? Well, a certain someone named Reggie Nelson, who was playing with the Cincinnati Bengals last year as their safety, he tied for a league best 8 interceptions with Marcus Peters, and that's just a coincidence for the topic of discussion. But Reggie Nelson leaving the Cincinnati Bengals now leaves a gap or a hole for the Cincinnati Bengals to fill. And by all means, the Cincinnati Bengals, they had 2 safeties that were going on the free agent market. They had George Iloka and then Reggie Nelson. And it was pretty much a given when Iloka had the one contract that Nelson was probably going to be gone. So Nelson goes over to the Raiders. He rejoins Jack Del Rio over there, who's the head coach, of course. Nelson having played with Del Rio in Jacksonville, I believe. So there's, again, that networking thing with the free agent stuff, but I'm getting a little off track. So the Cincinnati Bengals now have a hole at the safety position. And why is that important to the Pittsburgh Steelers? Why is that news, and how does that affect the Pittsburgh Steelers come draft day and the first round of the NFL draft? Maybe even the second or third round, depending, because if you are or aren't aware, the Pittsburgh Steelers will be drafting from the 25th position in the NFL draft. And by virtue of beating the Cincinnati Bengals and going deeper into the playoffs, that means the Cincinnati Bengals land at position 24, exactly one spot in front of the Steelers. For those of you with a longer-term memory and can remember the 2015 draft about 1 year ago, many had the Pittsburgh Steelers looking at tight end Max Williams from Minnesota, particularly in the second round. For those of you who remember, The Baltimore Ravens, also an AFC North division opponent, jumped ahead of the Pittsburgh Steelers with a trade for fear that the Steelers would draft Williams ahead of the Ravens' position. Once again, if we recall, the Ravens defeated the Pittsburgh Steelers in the playoffs and ended up a few positions behind with the Steelers drafting before the Ravens. So once again, this same situation between AFC North rivals could play out in this year's 2016 NFL Draft, except this time, will the Pittsburgh Steelers have to be in a position to leap ahead of the Bengals to get the player that they want? Let me explain. The Steelers so far, and if you consult, and my head's almost mush, we have a 2016 draft preview. My head is mush because over the weekend we've updated, and there are 18 draft visitors with another 8 that have just arrived as I am recording this podcast, actually, and we'll have that guide updated. If you haven't seen it yet, it's a really neat detailed book with all the draft visitors. The Pittsburgh Steelers get up to 30 pre-draft visits. They're mostly looking at safeties, cornerbacks, and also defensive tackles, a few other players mixed in. They're going to look at they're interviewing a wide receiver. And all these interviews are important because the Steelers tend to usually select players with whom they've shown interest in these pre-draft visits. So if you haven't had a chance, you could head on over to steelcityunderground.com. It's over in our guide section. You could also find it on the homepage or anywhere on social media. We pretty much have it linked. It's also the pinned tweet over on our Twitter. It's a free ebook you could sign up for that has all of the current pre-draft visits and the players that have visited the Pittsburgh Steelers. Those visits, getting back on topic, it's showing that the Steelers have a vested interest in trying to select a safety, and a lot of the players that they're looking at are first-round quality talent safeties so far. The Cincinnati Bengals also have a hole at safety. They could end up taking one of these players should they have mutual interest or vested interest in one of the same players that the Pittsburgh Steelers are interviewing. Now, I haven't been able to cross-reference because the Pittsburgh Steelers are one of the very few teams in the NFL that make all of our lives easier, especially mine. They let us know about all of these visits publicly, where a lot of other teams are like top secret confidential information. They just don't want anybody to know their business because they want to be secretive and then steal that player out from someone else. Being able to draft them. So looking over at the Cincinnati Bengals depth chart, and of course they have George Iloka back. There are other backups that are on the roster, and I'm looking at, they have Darren Smith as a free safety as one of the potential fill-ins or replacements for Reggie Nelson. He was drafted in the 6th round of last year's draft. So the other player, Floyd Raven, was a college free agent from last year as well. So both of these players, Smith and Raven, they have like a year under their belt. So Cincinnati's very thin at the safety position. And as we are aware, the Bengals have been in a position where they have a fairly talented roster, and they've been able, even through some of their free agent moves that they've made so far this season, like they signed wide receiver Brandon LaFell. That's to put them in a position after having lost Marvin Jones and Mohamed Sanu. They now have a veteran wide receiver. They may look at drafting a wide receiver. They also signed linebacker Carlos Dansby, formerly of the Cleveland Browns, within the same division, as a little bit of depth for when Vontaze Burfict has to serve his 3-game suspension as well. And Dansby could end up being even a bigger contributor beyond that. So the Bengals have pretty much put themselves in line to choose the best player available. That best player available, in my opinion, starts to look at the same type of safety talent pool that the Pittsburgh Steelers are eyeballing. So when you look at two players that are on their roster currently, do we think that the Bengals feel that a 6th-round draft pick and a college football free agent from last year's draft are suitable replacements for a Reggie Nelson, who tied the NFL with the league best 8 interceptions last year? Ooh, that's a tough question. And that's something that I really can't say for sure. what the Bengals are going to do. We don't know even what the Steelers are really going to do, but it leaves the question, would the Steelers put themselves in a position or attempt to move up positions to try and grab a player that might otherwise end up with the Cincinnati Bengals? Because we know the Bengals love their secondary. They love acquiring first-round talent, whether that's a free agent that was formerly drafted in the first round like Pac-Man Jones, who was re-signed back on March 15th of this year. So he's coming back. They also took one guy that was definitely linked to the Pittsburgh Steelers a couple years ago in Michigan State cornerback Darqueze Dennard. Try saying that one 3 times fast. And then also they have another first rounder with Dre Kirkpatrick. So we already know the infatuation that Cincinnati has with taking first round players. So the question will be, do the Pittsburgh Steelers, are they going to be tipped off and feel that they'll take whatever the scraps are that are left over and be patient and pick in position at pick 25? And if they do, will their guy be off the board and they end up going another direction? So it's very interesting to see that maybe the Pittsburgh Steelers don't end up with a safety in the first round. If the Cincinnati Bengals choose to go that direction, they could end up with a nose tackle, a defensive tackle. We see some guys that are on this in the pre-draft visits that are in the guide that show us that they are looking at guys that could play swing. They could play either defensive tackle or defensive end. So that could be the direction the Pittsburgh Steelers go. Should their best player available come off the board, that safety being the best player available, come off the board 1 pick ahead of them. So I implore you to look around the league and see how some of these other decisions that happen with other teams can negatively impact the process that the Pittsburgh Steelers are going through to build their Super Bowl contending roster. Because now that Reggie Nelson is gone, the Cincinnati Bengals have a hole to fill. And that hole could be filled with one of the guys the Steelers are looking at. And the same mentality as the Baltimore Ravens felt, they needed a tight end and they wanted to weaken a division opponent by not allowing that opponent to select the tight end that they were looking at. This could happen once again in the 2016 draft. I'll tell you what, I'm very interested. I'm going to be tuning in. I encourage you to do the same. I'd like to thank all of you once again for listening, as you always do. You're great listeners, followers. Once again, check out that 2016 draft preview guide that's over on steelcityunderground.com. Once again, that'll be updated. Currently, it's at 18 players. We'll be at 26 of the 30 eligible pre-draft visits within the next day or so. So continue to look for updates there throughout our social media and on the website. Until then, be good, take care, and I will talk to you later.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.